So, we speak about our culture
Mm-hmm.
and how we, here in the United States, how do we move the culture forward in ways of, just communication and what's important for our legacy and our traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough conversation sometimes when you have amongst people because we talk about culture only from an aspect of, music and just like style,
Mm-hmm.
but not other things that are I think are extremely important as far as how we operate as a people.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the question becomes like, how do we move our culture forward?
Right. I think that it's important to first like identify what we consider to be our culture, right?
Right.
And who is who is us. And I think, of course, we're African Americans and we have a shared set of experiences,
Hmm.
but we have to acknowledge that within like that subset of Africans,
Hmm.
there's also other subsets within African American
Right,
culture,
right,
right?
yeah.
So I think that to kind of be able to answer the question of like how we move our culture forward, we have to um, identify like what our culture is as far as like us as an individual,
Right,
right?
okay.
I think it kind of starts. I think it's important to start with family, right? Because your family is your first introduction to um, like just morals and what drives you, and
Hmm.
why. And so I think it's important to focus on family first and understanding, what is our core set of values,
Hmm.
and why. And why is it important to maintain these things? And then once you can kind of like establish that, then you can find people outside of your family who align with your ideas. But
Hmm.
I think especially today it's kind of difficult to um, be kind of hard set or, you know, firm in your beliefs because it's kind of taken as judgment on other people and their beliefs, their set of beliefs, right?
Yeah. That's one thing that we run across a lot is not, I guess, not knowing what's going too far
Mm-hmm.
and how to respect boundaries. Because as you mentioned before, there are different subsets even here in America.
Mm-hmm.
There's different religious beliefs. People celebrate different things, and we're very unique as far as the diaspora is concerned here in America, to where we have all these different cultures influencing one another, and it's like we have a lot of built up, animosity or anger towards what we should or shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be understanding that, hey, we all have a different walk, but we all can still have a basic, like, fundamental understanding that, hey, even though I don't agree with doing this, I shouldn't make that be the reasoning why we can't still either have some type of united front or get along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like being able to move the culture forward is also just having that respect,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not always about just how other people view us, it's how our children view us too, how we view each other,
Mm-hmm.
and how in ways of, like I mentioned before, communication. So, moving the culture forward, I think, is how you do so is like with respect for one.
Mm-hmm.
And then like establishing, like, if we want to create things that are new,
Mm-hmm.
that's great, right? So you have a family and you have your own customs and own traditions that you do as a family. And then when you connect with other families, it becomes, a larger like culture of what you created. And when you start, branching out and you start, networking with other families, it becomes more of a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important that when you do that, to also don't diminish or don't downplay others, as long as it's not really harming you
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. So when we speak of like, traditions and customs,
Mm-hmm.
these things can be literally created, or, as you know, I enjoy just studying cultures, especially when we talk about African cultures, because a lot of things we've lost, as we all know, a lot of things that we've kept, but we have to be able to also learn and adopt other things that we can infuse into our own family lives
Mm-hmm.
and our own community and move that into the future if we want to have a positive like type of culture.
Mm-hmm. And I think
You know?
it's important to acknowledge that we don't have to start over every generation, right?
Right.
As far as like traditions and cultures, and it's kind of like goes against what you're actually trying to do, which is
Hmm.
develop something that lasts, right? So I think it's very easy, you know, as we, you know, come into ourselves, we want to establish new things or whatever. But do we diminish what's already been established, right? Or do we build upon that? So an example that I have is like with the Nation of Islam, right? So just looking at how they've come into kind of this new era, this new technological era, right?
Right.
So, you know, back in the day, it was, you know, selling final calls and bean pies and all that good stuff, and that was, you know, and teachings from the minister and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that was the way, you know, ideas were spread, right? But now, you know, you see many people in the nation utilizing Instagram and utilizing YouTube, utilizing, you know, social media, and not a preachy way, not only using it to discuss what was discussed at whatever meeting or whatever lecture, but just being, you know, so you might see somebody just making bean soup on YouTube, right? Or discussing like a current event on Instagram, you know, like Riza Islam and, you know, different people like that who just discuss current events, you know, and then through that people kind of see who you are, you know, and so your culture kind of shines through, right? And so I think that that's one way to move the culture forward, but in order to do that you have to be firm in who you are, right? So you're not so that goes back to understanding like what is your culture, right? And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we qualify what we believe and why we believe it, right? Because so if you and I, you know, believe in two completely different things, right? I don't have to diminish what you believe, and I also don't have to like acknowledge it, if that makes sense. Like, it sounds dismissive, but you cannot. So I can't I can either work to solidify my culture, right, and find like-minded people, or I can work to validate everybody else's culture, like right?
Yeah.
But you can't do everything. You can't do it all at once, right? So I think that it's kind of like live and let live, right? So I can, if I have ideas about what's important to, you know, our family culture, right? That's what's important to it, you know? I don't have to say, oh, but I understand that some people do this, and then derail whatever we're teaching our children, right? To teach them about what other people are doing, you know? Yeah,
that's a good point. Knowing who you are, standing firm in that, and then something that you brought up with technology is extremely important because that's also part of culture and, you know, technological advances and things that we use to be innovative. So part of it is like, you know, we speak a whole lot about our ancient cultures and how we were so technology, you know, had so much technology, so advanced, and here we look in the year, you know, 2020. You know, what are we doing right now to push things forward, to be on the leading edge of conversations that are, you know, that are being written and historical references that people can look back on and say, look what they've created. And with the use of like social media, you know, it's a different world now, whereas our generations where we were like in between, we had an experience without it and then we came into it, where now you have a generation who was born into it. So all they know in communicating is, you know, through the mediums of social media, internet. So it's like with them having that particular, you know, devices and technology, what do they stand firm in and what are they going to create to move forward? And I think that having that identity about who they are, and when we say who you are, it's not always, you know, so, I guess, flagrant about what you shouldn't do, what you shouldn't be, right? Just about, hey, you are a great individual based off this. You know, you can speak about history, this is what you come from. And then from there you move forward and say, you know, how can we make things better for our people, you know, for our tribe and, you know, our particular, you know, village. What do we do moving forward? And I think that being part of moving into the science conversation is important. That's what, you know, in order to move the culture forward, you have to be able to innovate things and create things and take a hard look into what can we utilize with the resources that we have access to, and then, you know, create things that the future generations can benefit from. You know, ultimately it's about old things are cool. You know, when we look at, you know, history and or classic things, if you want to call it those type of things, but moving forward, like what can we use now? You know, what's beneficial to us right now? And I think part of the issue is that as a people, we have a real hard time learning to be humble enough to learn, but learn in a way where it's going to go against what you know, always have done. If you know that you haven't been the best person when it comes to your attitude, maybe, right? So we talk about communicating with one another. Well, you know, that would be, we say, okay, this is not good for the culture. It's not good for the culture to where when we communicate with one another, if you don't like what I have to say or you don't like my particular belief system, that you know, lash out at me to where now we're enemies and we can't even move forward. We can't discuss business. You know, so it's like, hey, if we want to adopt something, if we consider ourselves African, right, and there's so many different tribes and countries, if we adopt, let's say, you know, parts of West African culture where when they communicate, it's doing service, like, I'm not going to embarrass you in public, something that you take over. So as a family, you know, when we go back to family, I'll say, okay, in this household, we don't embarrass one another, especially in public. We don't try to go out our way to make somebody feel a certain way so we can feel better, or try to teach them, give them tough love to where our methods of teaching is one of shame. We don't do that in this family. And then this is why we don't do it. You give the reasonings, and also this is part of your heritage, right? So being able to say you need to unlearn certain things, and then when you connect with another family and they do the same things, now you have a, you know, companionship outside of your home, and you build from there, right? And that then ties into, you know, creating villages and using technology to find how to create things. So I think that ultimately it's utilizing everything we have at our, you know, in our arm's reach, and how we have the internet to where we can find so many different, you know, resources to get access to, and using those things to move forward with our people.
And using those things like as a baseline, right? Because I think sometimes where we get stuck is we take things very literal, or we begin to argue about the literal interpretation of everything that we see, right? So for instance, if we take like a religious text, right? There's many different religious texts. And so if two people don't agree, you know, they might find themselves arguing over the details. Well, how is this possible that this could have happened in this time and this time?
Right.
How is it possible that these people were here and then they just all came over here? You know, and it's just like, I feel like, so for me, the way I've been able to move past those like minute, kind of inconsequential arguments, right? Like okay, let's for instance talk about like the Bible, right? You can take it literally or you can take it as a parable. Either way, you can take the lesson from it and move forward, you know, instead of arguing about the details of the lesson, you know? Because I think, like again, you can only focus on so much, right? So I think that we are historians, you know, we understand history, or we like to, you know, reference history, but we also have to take it with not a grain of salt, but understand that there's progression, right? So when we look at, you know, West African traditions, or, you know, are we looking at the way that they evolved? Like, are we interacting with people from West Africa, you know, or people from wherever, you know, East Africa, different areas in Africa? Are we interacting with the 2020 version of these people? Or are we just looking at text and looking at, you know, papers and, you know, scholarly articles and stuff like that, and then saying, this is what they did, this is what we need to be doing now, you know, because that's kind of ignorant to assume that what they were doing however many years ago, that if left untouched, they would still be doing that now. And so that's why I think it's important to, even though you can be extremely proud and extremely firm in like who we are as, you know, African Americans, right? It's important to be able to reach out to other cultures, right? So you have cultures in this world who were not colonized, right? Or who were not so affected culturally by invasion, you know? And so while you might not want to mimic those cultures, like I would think about some Asian cultures, that are very steeped in tradition and seem to have been able to hold on to that tradition and bring it into the new age, right? Mm-hmm. You can look at those cultures and kind of just, even if you just want to timeline the progression, it's not about copying them, right? Mm-hmm. Or, assimilating to now their culture, but just seeing how, when left untouched, how did this ancient culture translate into the new day, and that's why I think it's really important to travel and travel open-heartedly and with an open mind,
Absolutely.
Because believe it or not, when we travel, so number one, we have to establish that African Americans are a thing, right? I understand that people feel African and all that good stuff, but we are African American. We live in America. Mm-hmm. We are influenced by American media. We have, all of these things that have trickled down to us, mm-hmm. right? Good and bad. And so we have to be cognizant of how we behave when we travel. Do we behave as Americans? Mm-hmm. Do we go to Africa mm-hmm. thinking that we're going to bring business to Africa, fix Africa mm-hmm. with our American ways? Do we go open with an open mind and open heart and go out there? What role can I play? Asking, mm-hmm. When you enter somebody else's space, you don't dictate mm-hmm. what they need. When I went to Ghana, like way back when, you can kind of get this idea where you're driving around and you're looking at the village and stuff like that, and it's like, oh man, I wish, they need this, they need that, yeah. They need that. Assuming that every country, they want to live in high rise, or they want to have, concrete jungle everywhere, yeah, as if, of course, medical advancements, things of that nature, but you don't know exactly what they want until you speak with them. Right. There's village and there's city mm-hmm. in every city in Africa, right? Yeah. So to assume that those who live a rural life, mm-hmm. Are wishing to have a life that looks more like yours is kind of arrogant, and it's a very American way of looking at the world,
Yeah, that is a very American way of looking at it, and sometimes you have to, be self-conscious of what it means to be an American, because mm-hmm. there's good and there's bad, right? Mm-hmm. But understanding that if we, when we want to move, if we choose to move somewhere else and mm-hmm. bring, who we are to another place, it's also, if they are asking for certain things, like, hey, we want you all to help build our economy, right? Mm-hmm. So we bring our American ways into their space, but being able to explain to them, hey, if we do this is what may become the outcome, right? Mm-hmm. If we decide to build these different restaurants or types of businesses, this is what, leads people to behave like, mm-hmm. If we choose to do so, like, and also saying, okay, it may not be the best thing to build this type of business. We can bring business and help with certain type of infrastructure, but this is what it creates. Mm-hmm. Do you want to become more American, or do you want to keep your traditional culture the way it is, and then have some elements of, what we learn and what we can do, bringing it here. Mm-hmm. And then when you do that, if you can make a cohesive type of thing, then you can push the culture forward in that type of sense. Mm-hmm. I think it's extremely important as well. You mentioned before about how, it's not necessarily trying to, emulate other cultures, but I think it's important that we can adopt certain things, understanding like why we do why does that culture do this? Like, why does that certain group of people, whether they're Asian or wherever, mm-hmm. Why do they do these certain things when they greet each other, or when they go out, or when they discuss certain issues? Like, why do they do that? What's the purpose behind it? Because since we've been stripped of so much of our culture that came from, prisoners of war, those things that we did then may not be conducive to the world now. Mm-hmm. So it's like you have to be able to adapt to the world we live in today. Mm-hmm. And if it's beneficial, we can take it on and adopt it. But if it's not, then we can shed it and we can keep moving forward. Because I think we always have to put ourselves in a position to think ahead, to like even here in the family, we talk about, 10, 15, 20 years later with the Maya, what are we going to do to make sure she doesn't have to experience X, Y, and Z, is thinking ahead.
Right.
And knowing, well, today, that means I can't do this now because I don't want it to snowball into something that we can't control 15 years later.
Right.
So with our culture, it's like, what is it that we can utilize and adopt and learn from, and then 20 years later, it can still work and we can perfect it. It's kind of like an example that I think that, we don't necessarily have to adopt, or just something we can learn from. Like, there's a Jewish community here in Houston, and there's a particular bakery that they were kosher status for like decades. Like, family moved over here, a long time ago to America, and then they during all the hurricanes and storms, they were in a way almost forced to be open on during Passover, and they lost their kosher status because of that. And like, so the kosher, I don't know if you would call them a league or whatever, whatever the institution that delivers the certifications and licenses that you're kosher, they stripped it from them. And it was not of like a bad thing as far as we don't like them. It was like, we wish them the best, but in other words, you violated a rule. So it's like having hard lines on what we can and cannot allow. I think right now, with our African American or black culture, whatever you want to call it, we have a way of not wanting to establish certain behaviors as something we could deem, good or bad. It's like everything is part of it. And it's like shouldn't have to change nothing about ourselves. So I think we look at it through the lens of being rebellious against our
like respectability or something.
Respectability is like, it's more than that though. It's about, if we want to move forward in a way that I think should be positive. I think culture is going to move forward, but it can always have its elements that shouldn't be like the cornerstone of what the culture means. So when we talk to one another, or how we behave in certain environments, it's good for us. It's not to be about everybody else. But also, history books are going to continuously be written. And if we don't control our own narratives and we don't establish that, hey, this is not how we behave in this environment, right? When we're doing this, that's fine, but here we don't do this. And then those two elements not being at war with each other, like if I decide I'm going to a family cookout and I use certain language and talk a certain way, and I should still be able to go to a gala that we've made, and I can behave a certain way here. These two elements should be at war with one another, like, oh, you're this type of person. No, it just means that we understand that in this environment, this is how we behave and this is how we act. So our children can be proud of the fact that they can aspire to go into certain things and be certain ways. So, socially speaking, I think culture is extremely important. So I know everything's not about social, but I think that's an important element. And I think as African Americans, we tend to not want to shed certain things, like I said before. So I think it's important that if we don't shed it, then give it its place. You can be certain ways here, but not over here.
And I think it's also acknowledging that there are people who aren't going to shed certain things, and there are people who are going to adapt certain things, right? And it goes back to like your example of the kosher status, right? So if I feel like living this way is the best for me, right? Then it's important to, I guess if I say living this way is the best for me and you are this way, we don't have to not be friends. I don't have to wish harm on you. We can still interact, right? As long as if we can find a common way to interact,
That's true.
But you might not be a part of certain celebrations. You might not be a part of certain gatherings, right? And it doesn't mean that I wish any harm on you. It just means that, our cultures don't align. And that's okay too. And we have to be able to be okay with being different and not forcing inclusion,
Yeah, that's extremely important. Just that respect that we should have for one another. And even I think now, even though a lot of us have, adopted European celebrations, and even those who may not be European, they still, it's something that European that don't do certain things, right? But even African Americans, we still celebrate certain things that we have an issue with. But it's like, sometimes everything is not such a big deal to where we can't still go in business with one another, or whatever have you, So I think it's having a respectable line, but realizing, hey, if you want to celebrate this, that's fine. But we don't celebrate that, and I respect that you do, but please respect that I don't. You know, so it's about it's one thing to, you know, not respect things, but disrespecting things is a whole other element.
Right.
So I think that we should shed being so disrespectful to move forward. But, you know, ultimately speaking, again, it's about, you know, social things and technology, utilizing what we have to move forward. You know, having foresight and travel, and how do you behave in you know, international lands. You know, are you coming off as American? Or are you coming off as, you know, African American? Or, you know, so establishing new things for ourselves, and then, you know, bringing things from the old days, if it can fit into the new days, and if it can't, to shed it. You know, so yeah, I think moving the culture forward is something that we definitely
It's a
can
big
do.
conversation.
Huge conversation, because it does itself a great service just to at least get the ball rolling.
Right.
And have ideas planted. So, yeah, babe.